We open in a dim kitchen, 1933. A battered kettle rattles on the stove. The scent of boiled onions and fresh bread crust fills the air. Outside, the wind rattles old wooden windows, and you can almost hear neighbors' muffled laughter through thin walls. It's not luxury, far from it, but there's warmth in the way people gather around simple, hearty meals. This intro paints the emotional contrast between scarcity and creativity, showing how necessity birthed dishes that were humble yet full of ingenuity. We'll hint at flavors, smells, and stories that will take viewers back, whether they lived it or heard it in family tales, and tease how these recipes can still stretch $1 today.
Depression-era pancakes. You can almost hear it now, the soft psh as a ladle of batter hits a well-worn cast-iron skillet, the scent of warm dough curling through a modest kitchen. These weren't the golden, butter-dripping flapjacks of modern brunch menus. No, these were humble creations. Just flour, baking powder, a pinch of salt, and water. No eggs, no milk, yet somehow they puffed up just enough to feel special. They were born from necessity, a product of the Great Depression, when every ingredient had to stretch like a dime on laundry day. Eggs were too precious, milk too expensive, but families still craved something warm to start the morning. A quick stir of pantry staples and a hot pan were all a tuck. You might have topped them with a thin smear of lard, or perhaps a spoonful of syrup made at home, brown sugar melted in water, until it turned into a dark caramel-scented drizzle. The sound of the spatula scraping the skillet was almost a breakfast bell, calling children from their chores or school books. One pancake might not seem like much, but in those times it was a burst of comfort, something to fill your stomach and give you energy for a long day in the fields, the factory, or the classroom. Mothers became masters of substitution. If there was a little cornmeal left, it found its way into the batter. Out of baking powder, a pinch of baking soda with vinegar did the trick. These small swaps weren't just about saving money. They were about keeping a sense of normalcy, of routine, when the world felt uncertain. And maybe that's why they're remembered so fondly today. Each bite was more than food. It was proof that even in lean times, a little creativity and care could turn the simplest ingredients into something that felt like home.
Cornmeal mush. Picture a pot on the stove, steam curling up in lazy spirals, carrying that faint nutty aroma of ground corn. The surface bubbles slowly, like it's in no hurry, while the wooden spoon makes its steady, scraping circles along the sides. This was cornmeal mush, simple, golden, and dependable. In the 1930s, when every penny had to work overtime, cornmeal was a blessing. You could buy it for just a few cents a pound, and that pound could stretch into multiple meals. In many homes, it started the day as a hot breakfast, thick and creamy, spooned into bowls and topped with a drizzle of molasses or a dusting of sugar if you were lucky. Some preferred it plain, letting the warm, slightly sweet corn flavor speak for itself. It filled your stomach and kept you going, whether the day ahead meant long hours in the fields or a chilly walk to school. But cornmeal mush had a second life waiting for it. Whatever was left in the pot by lunchtime would be poured into a shallow pan, left to cool, and firmed up into a solid slab. By supper, it was sliced and fried in a cast-iron skillet until the edges turned crispy and golden brown, the center still soft. Paired with a bit of gravy, syrup, or even beans, it became a whole new dish without costing another cent. That was the magic of it. Versatility born from necessity. Cornmeal mush wasn't fancy, but it was resourceful. It taught families that with a little creativity, one humble ingredient could stretch across days and still feel like a fresh meal each time. and maybe that's why so many remember it fondly. It was proof that even in hard times, we could make something warm, comforting, and shared around the table.
Water toast. You can almost hear it, the soft hiss as a slice of bread meets a hot pan, not with butter or oil, but with a quick splash of water and whatever flavorful drippings yesterday's meal left behind. The steam rises immediately, carrying a warm, savory scent through the kitchen, curling around you like a gentle hug on a cold morning. This was water toast, born from tight times when butter was a luxury and margarine still had to be rationed. Bread was affordable enough and water was free, but a clever cook knew how to make the two taste like more. The water softened the bread just enough, while the pan's heat gave it a lightly crisped surface. And, if you were lucky, there might be a sprinkle of sugar or, on the best of days, a dusting of cinnamon that made it smell like a holiday morning. In the 1930s and 40s, this wasn't just breakfast. It was survival disguised as comfort. Families made do with what they had, and often what they had was simple bread, a hot stove, and a little creativity. The sizzle of water toast was more than a sound. It was the assurance that there would still be something warm to eat, even when the pantry looked bare. For children, it didn't feel like making do. It felt like home. You'd sit at the table, biting into the soft center and slightly crisped edges, steam still escaping as you chewed. It wasn't extravagant, but it was yours, and it was made with care. Looking back, water toast stands as a quiet symbol of resilience. It's proof that even when times were lean, a dash of ingenuity in a warm kitchen could turn the plainest slice of bread into something that felt like love on a plate.
Oatmeal with apple peels. The kitchen filled with a gentle, fruity steam as the pot simmered, thin curls of apple peels swirling among bubbling oats, their edges softening, releasing a warm, almost cinnamon-like scent. It wasn't apple pie, but on a chilly morning, it felt just as comforting. Back in the days when every scrap of food had value, nothing edible went to waste, not even the skins from apples. If someone had peeled fruit for a pie, a snack, or canning, those peels and the apple cores found their way into the breakfast pot. A handful of rolled oats, some water or milk if it was available, and a slow simmer transformed what might have been tossed away into something that tasted like a treat. In the 1930s and 40s, sugar was expensive, and rationing during wartime made it even harder to come by. Apple peels were nature's sweetener, adding a subtle flavor and fragrance that turned plain oats into something special. Sometimes a pinch of cinnamon or nutmeg made its way in, but often the apples alone carried the dish. You'd sit at the table, spoon in hand, watching the steam curl up and feeling the bowl's warmth seep into your fingers. Each bite was soft and hearty, the apple lending a little burst of flavor here and there. It wasn't fancy, but it was satisfying. One of those meals that stuck with you through the morning. Oatmeal with apple peels was more than frugality. It was ingenuity. It showed that a kitchen didn't need abundance to feel abundant. Every peel, every core, every bit of flavor was treasured. And somehow, knowing that nothing was wasted made the meal taste just a little sweeter, like you were part of a quiet tradition of making the most of what you had.
Hoover stew. Picture a big pot on the stove, lid rattling as steam escapes, filling the kitchen with a tangy, savory scent that makes your stomach growl. Inside, elbow macaroni swirls in a red tomato broth, slices of hot dog bobbing to the surface, kernels of sweet corn dotting the mix like little bursts of sunshine. It wasn't gourmet, but it was warm,
filling and ready to feed a crowd. Hoover stew earned its name during the Great Depression, a wry nod to President Herbert Hoover, who was often blamed for the nation's hardships. The recipe wasn't written in any fancy cookbook. It lived in the kitchens of boarding houses, church basements, and bustling family homes. All you needed was pasta, canned tomatoes, a can of corn, and the cheapest hot dogs you could find. Everything went into one pot, simmered together until the pasta was tender and the flavors mingled. In the 1930s, it was the kind of meal you could serve to a table full of hungry kids for just a few cents per person. No side dishes, no extras, just ladle it into bowls and watch it disappear. The tang of tomatoes, the salty bite of hot dogs, the sweetness of corn, it was a balance that didn't need much dressing up. If you were lucky, maybe there'd be a slice of bread to mop up the last bit of sauce. It was more than food. It was community in a pot. Neighbors would share a batch during church socials or after long work days. Everyone gathered shoulder to shoulder with steaming bowls in hand. Hoover stew was a reminder that even in lean times, people could come together, stretch what they had, and still enjoy a hot, hearty meal that felt like it belonged to everyone at the table.
You could smell it before you saw it. The earthy aroma of potato peels slowly simmering with chopped onions, filling the kitchen with a warmth that felt almost like a wool blanket on a cold day. The pot would bubble gently, steam fogging up the nearby window as if the house itself was sighing in relief. Potatoes were already a staple during hard times, but their peels, normally destined for the compost, became the star of this humble winter soup. In the 1930s and 40s, when nothing could be wasted, families learned that the thin skins held just as much flavor as the potato itself. Add in an onion, maybe a carrot if one was rolling around in the pantry, and you had the makings of a broth that could stretch across several meals. A small dash of salt, precious but powerful, transformed it. Suddenly, the broth had depth, the peels turning tender and silky, the onions releasing their sweetness into the mix. If you were lucky, there might be a splash of milk or a knob of lard stirred in, giving the soup a little richness. Served with a hunk of bread, it wasn't just dinner, it was an act of resourcefulness in a bowl. On long winter evenings, you'd wrap your hands around the warm tin cup or chipped ceramic bowl, letting the steam rise into your face. Each sip was simple, yes, but also deeply satisfying. You knew every ingredient had been stretched to its limit, nothing wasted, everything appreciated. Potato peel soup was more than just frugality. It was a quiet lesson in making the most of what you had. In the leanest seasons, it proved that even scraps could be transformed into something comforting enough to gather a family around the table and make them feel, for a moment, full in every sense of the word.
Cabbage soup. The first thing you noticed was the smell, a sweet, peppery aroma drifting from the pot, wrapping around the whole kitchen like a wool scarf. The cabbage leaves, pale green and curling at the edges, bobbed gently in the bubbling broth, their steam fogging up the windows and making the room feel just a little smaller, a little cozier. During the Great Depression, cabbage was a hero ingredient. At just a few cents a pound, it could be stretched into meal after meal, feeding a family without emptying the coin jar. Packed with vitamins, it offered a bit of brightness in the winter months when fresh produce was scarce. Families would slice it thin, toss it in a pot with onions, carrots, maybe a potato or two, and let it simmer until everything softened into a sweet, hearty soup. If there was meat, it was only a scrap, perhaps a ham bone left over from Sunday, dropped in to add depth to the broth. But even without it, the soup carried a satisfying balance, the cabbage's gentle sweetness playing against the pepper's mild bite,
A pinch of salt, carefully measured from the tin, made it taste like more than the sum of its parts. You'd sit at the table, hands curled around the bowl, watching the steam curl upward, while the first spoonful warmed you from the inside out. Outside, the wind might rattle the windows, but inside, the scent of cabbage soup promised that you'd end the day with something filling in your stomach. It wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't meant to be. Cabbage soup was a workhorse, a reminder that nourishment didn't have to be complicated. In those lean years, it was proof that even the simplest ingredients, given enough time and care, could bring comfort that lingered long after the last spoonful was gone.
Vegetable and stew. The pot on the stove didn't hold perfect glossy vegetables. It was a patchwork of odds and ends. Carrot tops trimmed down to tender stalks, wilted greens rescued from the back of the icebox, a handful of leftover beans from last night's supper. As it simmered, the kitchen filled with a deep, savory aroma that hinted at garlic, onions, and the earthiness of garden soil after rain. During the lean years of the Great Depression and into wartime, every scrap of food counted. Community gardens sprouted in backyards, empty lots, and even church lawns, where neighbors tended rows of vegetables side by side. And when harvest time came, there was a quiet barter system. Your extra handful of beans for someone else's bunch of spinach. Your wilted kale swapped for their softening potatoes. Nothing was wasted. Even the ugly or leftover parts went into the pot. Vegetable and stew was never exactly the same twice. Some days it leaned green and leafy, other days it turned hearty and orange from carrots and squash. Broth came from boiling bones or simply from water seasoned with salt, pepper, and whatever herbs were on hand. A crust of bread, or better yet, cornbread, turned it from a thin meal into a satisfying one. It wasn't just frugality. It was a kind of culinary neighborliness. The stew pot told the story of the street, the garden rows, and the people who shared what they had. Each bite carried the flavor of many hands contributing. Someone's beans, someone's cabbage, someone's pinch of dried thyme. Sitting down to a steaming bowl of vegetable and stew wasn't just about filling your stomach. It was a reminder that survival was sweeter and somehow tastier when the whole community had a hand in making sure no one went without.
Mock chicken legs. At first glance, you might have sworn they were real drumsticks. Golden brown, crispy on the outside, lined up on a platter like a Sunday feast. But one bite told a different story. Instead of tender chicken meat, the inside was a mix of ground pork or veal, seasoned just right and shaped carefully around a small wooden stick or skewer. Mock chicken legs became popular during the lean years of the Great Depression and carried on through wartime rationing. Real chicken could be expensive, and when you did have it, it was often stretched across soups or stews. But ground pork or veal? That was cheaper and could be transformed with the right spices and a good breading. A quick dip in egg, or even a bit of milk mixed with flour if eggs were scarce, then rolled in breadcrumbs, and into the hot skillet or oven they went. As they cooked, the kitchen filled with that irresistible scent of sizzling breading and seasoned meat, enough to make anyone wander in to check if dinner was ready. The outside turned crisp and golden, while the inside stayed juicy and savory, the flavors mingling with just a hint of pepper or sage. But the real magic wasn't just in the taste, it was in the presentation. These clever creations looked like a proper roast chicken dinner, and in times when morale was just as important as nutrition, it mattered. For kids, it felt like a special treat, and for the adults, It was a small victory, a way to serve something that looked abundant, even if resources were thin. Mock chicken legs were a reminder that food was never just about filling the belly. It was about comfort, dignity, and the simple joy of making the table feel full, no matter what you had to work with.
Meatloaf with oatmeal. The smell would hit you first, savory and rich with just a hint of onion before you even opened the oven door. Inside, a golden brown loaf was slowly developing that perfect crackling crust, the edges sizzling where the pan drippings had pooled. This wasn't just any meatloaf. This was the Depression-era staple that made a single pound of ground meat stretch like magic. Oatmeal was the secret. In the 1930s and 40s, when meat was expensive and often rationed, rolled oats were cheap, filling, and easy to come by. Mixed into the seasoned ground beef, sometimes pork or a combination, they absorbed the juices, keeping the loaf moist while doubling its size. A beaten egg, when available, helped bind it together, and a little ketchup or tomato paste on top added both flavor and color. As it baked, the oats disappeared into the meat, no longer recognizable, but quietly doing their job. The sound of the crust crackling when the pan came out of the oven was enough to draw the whole family to the table early. The real treat came when it was sliced thick, each piece holding its shape, and served alongside a generous spoonful of gravy made right from those pan drippings. For many, meatloaf night was the definition of comfort food. It was hearty enough to satisfy after a long day's work, yet humble enough to feel like home. Leftovers, if there were any, made the best cold sandwiches the next day, a little ketchup spread between two slices of bread. Meatloaf with oatmeal wasn't just thrifty, it was resourceful cooking at its finest. It proved that with a little creativity, you could take what you had, make it feed more mouths, and still put something on the table that everyone looked forward to all week.
Baked bean casserole. Long before you saw it, you could smell it. That deep, sweet, smoky aroma drifting from the oven, wrapping the whole house in warmth. Inside, the casserole dish bubble lazily, beans swimming in a thick, mahogany-colored sauce of molasses, onions, and just enough seasoning to make your mouth water. Every so often, a bubble would break the surface with a gentle plop, sending up a puff of steam that carried a promise. Dinner would be worth the wait. In the 1930s and 40s, baked bean casserole was more than a meal. It was a strategy. Beans were cheap, hearty, and full of protein, and when baked low and slow, they turned tender and flavorful without much fuss. Molasses added sweetness and depth, and if you were lucky, there might be bits of bacon or salt pork tucked in for smoky richness. Families often baked a large pan on Saturday, so there'd be enough to serve through Sunday and maybe into Monday, cutting down on cooking during busier, fuel-scarce days. The beauty of baked bean casserole was its staying power. It kept well, tasted even better the next day, and could stretch to feed unexpected guests without anyone feeling shortchanged. Served with slices of fresh bread, cornbread, or biscuits, it was the kind of dish that filled stomachs and brought people together around the table. For children, it was comfort in a bowl, warm, slightly sweet, with just a hint of savory smokiness. For adults, it was reassurance that there'd be enough to go around. And for everyone, it was a reminder that food didn't have to be fancy to feel abundant. Baked bean casserole was proof that patience, a few humble ingredients, and the slow magic of the oven could create something hearty enough to last for days, and loved enough to be remembered for decades.
Eggless meat patties. You could hear them before you saw them. The gentle sizzle in the skillet as flattened patties browned to a perfect golden crust. The smell was a mix of roasted potato, toasty breadcrumbs, and just a hint of savory meat, enough to make everyone in the house drift toward the kitchen.
Eggless meat patties were born from necessity when both meat and eggs were too precious to use freely. In the lean years of the Great Depression and wartime rationing, a pound of ground beef, if you could get it, had to feed a whole family, sometimes for several days. The solution? Stretch it with what you had on hand. Mashed potatoes made up the bulk, breadcrumbs added texture, and small flecks of meat provided just enough flavor to keep it satisfying. A little onion or leftover gravy from the night before could be mixed in to give them extra depth. Shaped into rounds or ovals, the patties were slipped into a hot pan, their edges crisping while the inside stayed soft and moist. The sound of them cooking was almost as comforting as the taste, each pop and crackle a reminder that dinner was well on its way. Served hot, maybe with a spoonful of vegetables or a ladle of gravy, they didn't pretend to be a full hamburger or steak, but they were filling, flavorful, and most importantly, they made the most of what little meat there was. Leftovers, if they survived the first meal, were just as good the next day, tucked between slices of bread for a quick lunch.
Fried bologna sandwich. You knew it was coming the moment you heard that sharp sizzle. A slice of bologna hitting a hot skillet, the edges curling up like little cupped hands. The scent was unmistakable, salty, savory, and just a bit smoky, drifting through the kitchen faster than you could grab a plate. Bologna was the working-class hero of lunchtime in the mid-20th century, cheap, filling, and easy to find at any grocery or corner market. In the 1940s and 50s, a whole pound might cost less than a quarter, making it a staple in homes where every penny counted. Frying it gave it a whole new personality. The heat concentrated the flavor. The texture changed from smooth to lightly crisped, and those curled edges begged to be pressed flat with a spatula. The bread? More often than not, it was day-old white bread, soft and slightly squishy, bought at a discount. A swipe of yellow mustard gave it a tangy kick, cutting through the richness of the fried bologna. Some folks added a slice of cheese if they had it, letting it melt right onto the meat, while others kept it plain and classic. For kids, this was a treat that felt special, even though it was simple. You'd bite into it, and the bread would give way to that warm, salty slice, the mustard hitting your tongue just as you chewed. For parents, it was the kind of meal you could throw together in minutes without breaking the budget. The fried bologna sandwich wasn't fancy, but it didn't need to be. It was proof that a hot pan, a few pantry staples, and a little sizzle could turn the humblest ingredients into something you'd remember decades later. Edges curled, mustard smudged on your cheek, and all.
Depression-era bread. The smell would drift through the whole house, warm, yeasty, and comforting, wrapping around you like a soft blanket on a cold day. Even before you saw the loaves, you could picture them. Golden brown tops, a dusting of flour still clinging to the crust, and a dense, hearty crumb inside that promised to fill you up. During the Great Depression, bread wasn't just a side, it was the backbone of many meals. With ingredients pared down to the essentials, just yeast, flour, salt, and water, it was affordable, reliable, and something you could make in your own kitchen without fancy equipment. A 25-pound bag of flour might cost less than $1 back then, and from it, a family could turn out loaf after loaf. The dough was often mixed by hand in a big bowl, kneaded until it was smooth and springy, then left to rise in a warm corner of the kitchen, sometimes covered with a dish towel that had seen better days. The scent during baking was enough to lift everyone's mood. Even if the pantry was nearly bare, the smell of fresh bread was a promise that there'd be something warm on the table. It was a bread built for purpose, dense enough to slice thin and still hold together under a smear of lard, jam, or peanut butter, if you had it. Stale slices were never wasted. They became toast, breadcrumbs, or even bread pudding.
For many families, Depression-era bread wasn't just about survival. It was about maintaining a sense of home and routine when the world outside felt uncertain. Breaking a loaf open at the table was a small act of togetherness, a reminder that even in hard times, the simplest ingredients could bring comfort, nourishment, and a reason to gather.
Potato biscuits. The moment you broke one open, steam would curl into the air, carrying that warm, earthy aroma of freshly mashed potatoes mixed with the buttery scent of fresh-baked bread. The inside was soft and fluffy, the outside just barely golden, with a texture so tender it almost melted on your tongue. Potato biscuits were a clever Depression-era twist on a classic, born from the need to stretch ingredients and make every bite last longer. By mixing mashed potatoes into the dough, leftovers from last night's dinner or boiled fresh if there were enough, cooks could use less flour, which was precious during rationing. Potatoes were cheap, easy to grow, and added a subtle sweetness that made the biscuits taste richer than they really were. The mashed potatoes also worked a little magic of their own. They kept the biscuits moist for days. That was important when you couldn't afford to bake fresh every morning. A batch made on Sunday could still be soft by Tuesday, ready to be split and filled with jam, a bit of meat, or even just a smear of lard. As they baked, the kitchen would fill with the comforting scent of bread and potatoes mingling in the warm oven air. Kids might hover near the table, waiting for permission to snatch the first one off the pan, too hot to hold but impossible to resist. Potato biscuits weren't flashy, but they were dependable, a small luxury in times when luxuries were scarce. They carried the kind of simple satisfaction that came from knowing you could take a humble, everyday ingredient and turn it into something that made a meal feel complete. In their soft, pillowy bite was a quiet reminder. Sometimes the best comfort comes from making the most of what you already have.
Johnny cakes. You could hear them before you saw them. Soft sizzles and faint pops as cornmeal batter hit the hot surface of a well-seasoned cast-iron skillet. The smell was earthy and toasty, with a hint of sweetness if sugar had been added, though more often than not, they were plain and honest, just like the times that birthed them. Johnny cakes were one of those Depression-era staples that felt like an old friend, simple, dependable, and always there when you needed them. Made from cornmeal, water, and a pinch of salt, they were a cousin to pancakes, but without the costly ingredients like milk or eggs. Sugar was a luxury, sprinkled in only if it happened to be on hand. Otherwise, you learned to love their rustic, slightly gritty texture and warm corn flavor just as they were. The batter was poured or spooned into the skillet, flattening into golden patties that crisped at the edges while staying soft in the middle. If you had molasses, honey, or a dab of butter, you might drizzle or spread it over the top, watching it melt into the warm surface. But they were just as good eaten plain, straight from the pan, the heat still radiating through your fingers. Cornmeal was cheap, pennies per pound in the 1930s, and kept well in the pantry, making Johnny cakes a perfect solution for stretching meals. They worked for breakfast, lunch, or supper, paired with beans, soups, or whatever vegetables were in season. There was nothing fancy about Johnny cakes, but that was part of the charm. They were food you could count on, a little taste of comfort in hard times. Each bite carried the hum of the skillet, the smell of warm corn, and the quiet satisfaction of turning the simplest ingredients into something that could fill both your belly and your spirit.
Lentil loaf. The scent drifted from the oven, warm, savory, with a faint nuttiness that told you something hearty was on the way. On the counter, a loaf pan bubbled gently, its contents slowly firming into a solid shape that could be sliced just like a traditional meatloaf. Only this one held no meat at all. It was a Depression-era creation made from humble lentils.
Lentils were a quiet hero in lean times. At just a fraction of the cost of meat, they were packed with protein and could be stored dry for months without spoiling. In the 1930s, a pound of lentils might cost just a few cents, yet could feed an entire family when cooked with care. Cooks would boil them until tender, then mash them with breadcrumbs, onions, and a bit of seasoning, sometimes even a splash of ketchup or tomato sauce for moisture. The mixture was pressed into a loaf pan, much like a meatloaf, and baked until the edges turned golden and the center set firm. When it came out of the oven, it could be sliced into thick, sturdy pieces that held together beautifully, ready to be served with gravy, vegetables, or even between slices of bread for a hearty sandwich the next day. What it lacked in beefy richness, it made up for in earthiness and comfort. The texture was dense but tender, the flavor wholesome and satisfying. Families didn't just eat lentil loaf because they had to. They learned to enjoy it, especially when paired with whatever herbs, spices, or sauces they could spare. Lentil loaf was more than a budget-friendly dish. It was a symbol of adaptability. It proved that with a little creativity, you could still serve something that felt substantial and nourishing, even when the butcher's counter was far beyond your budget.
And maybe that's the real beauty in all these dishes. We weren't just cooking. We were finding ways to keep hope on the table. These meals, born out of necessity, carried more than just calories. They carried the hum of a busy kitchen, the clatter of plates being set out, and the comfort of knowing that no matter how thin the pantry shelves looked, something warm and filling would always appear. We learned that flavor didn't come from expensive ingredients. It came from care, from time, from the small touches like a sprinkle of pepper, a crisp crust, or a drizzle of homemade syrup. We discovered that food could be a storyteller, whispering memories of the hands that made it and the people we shared it with. The truth is, the Great Depression and wartime kitchens didn't just feed bodies, they fed resilience. Every loaf of bread, every pot of soup, every humble slice of Johnny cake was a quiet reminder that even in the hardest seasons, people could still create something worth gathering around. And perhaps that's why these recipes linger in our minds today, not because they were glamorous, but because they were real. They remind us of simpler times when the smell of something baking could brighten an entire day, and when stretching a meal wasn't a hardship, but a skill to be proud of. So maybe the next time you find yourself with a handful of scraps, a bag of beans, or a bit of leftover bread, you might just find that in reviving them, you're not only making a meal, you're keeping alive a tradition of resourcefulness, comfort, and the unshakable belief that a warm kitchen can make the world feel a little softer.